In 2010, Team Grigri released a game called Corpse Party. It was kind of a big deal, you could say. 2 years later, Team Grigri would release a spin-off comedy visual novel, Corpse Party, the anthology. It wasn't very good, but packaged with that game's limited edition was a mysterious DVD labeled Corpse Party Missing Footage. It was just a 10-minute animation depicting the characters going about their lives before the events of the first game. This is kind of cute. They do start with about 2 minutes depicting the gruesome child murder at the center of the game's plot, a decision so bafflingly dissonant with the rest of the short that it's kinda hilarious. I know it's literally called Corpse Party, but it's not like a hard rule. However, with that little addition, you can honestly say that this little OVA accurately depicts the breadth of what Corpse Party is about. Gruesome, bloody torture, socially immature teenagers awkwardly indicating their feelings for one another, homosexuality, and I can't show the Yuko thing, but you know what the Yuko thing is. So it's not just a bit of lighthearted fan service, it actually does its own decent little job at marketing the series. If someone unfamiliar with Corpse Party saw this, they'd be able to understand basically what they're in for. Which makes it really weird that this was only ever released in the limited edition of the comedy spin-off. They could put this on the Mage's YouTube channel right now, give it subtitles, and it would probably get a lot of people to think, maybe I should check out this Corpse Party thing. But now that I say it, this hypothetical person might feel inspired not to check out the video games. They instead might seek out the subject of this video. It's been over a decade, so this context is a bit lost. But the same day Missing Footage was out, Mage's announced an OVA that said would be a sequel to it, with the same staff and all. Now, Missing Footage is already a prequel, so they'd be making a sequel to the prequel to the original, which just means they're adapting Blood Covered into an anime. In the West, they just called it Corpse Party, Tortured Souls. The full title in Japanese is Corpse Party, Tortured Souls, Bogyaku Sarete Tamashi no Jukyo, which can be translated as Corpse Party, Tortured Souls, The Curse of Tortured Souls. Sorry, I'm rambling, I just love the needlessly confusing marketing of Corpse Party. You think they just name it after the game it's an adaptation of, but the team is always on some crazy shit. So, on July 23rd, 2013, they finally released the 4-episode OVA. This is what we now refer to as the Corpse Party anime. Now, I talk about the game with a lot of reverence, right? The original and its reboot are both really foundational pieces of the RPG Maker scene. The anime, I would say, eclipses the reputation of the games by a little bit. And not exactly by being some foundational or genre-defining work, but rather by its notoriety. There's this review of the anime by Theron Martin of Anime News Network, where the first line of the review portion states, "Whatever else might be said about this 4-episode OVA series, there's exactly one thing you need to know. It ranks among the most gruesomely graphic anime titles ever made." I feel like that really just says it all. And this is coming from what I'm told is the internet's most trusted anime news source. Although the original game was great, and many would say quite gruesome, I don't recall it ever receiving anywhere near the same extreme declarations. You get maybe a bit of hyperbole, nothing this grand. I mean, sure, the anime has to render everything from the game in detail and motion rather than relegating anything to the abstraction of pixel art. And there's a notorious history to violent video games that might make it feel a bit quaint in comparison. But language like this goes a little bit beyond medium comparison. Now, apparently series creator Makoto Kedwin once said that Corpse Party was an OVA instead of a TV anime due to censorship issues. Which, to my understanding, is saying that they'd have to compromise the content of the game to comply with Japanese media regulation of the time. It makes sense to me, because the game gets away with a lot by relying on its sound design and text narration. Capturing something like I hear it scraping my skull from the inside through a visual medium is going to be a bit harder, and I seem to remember that Missing Footage bumped up the age rating of the anthology all on its own. I guess the Corpse Party OVA punching above its weight in terms of popularity sort of gave it an easy hand to play against popular television anime of its time, which presumably would have seen at least a little bit more restriction. That doesn't quite feel like the full story. It might have stuck with people because it's gruesome, but why did it get the chance to reach them in the first place? There's something else there, right? It can't just be the Corpse Party pedigree giving it a boost. I don't really have any killer evidence here, but I think part of it might have been the studio. Both Missing Footage and Tortured Souls were animated by Studio Asried. I'm not too familiar with them just by the name, but from reading their Wikipedia page, apparently they'd just gotten done with their adaptation of Future Diary. And Future Diary was really popular. Now in my mind, doing the research for this video, Future Diary was in a similar tier to Elfen Lied, top 80 on Mal. Turns out it's top 40. This is in between Bleach and Haikyuu? I just didn't have that impression before. So now I can see it perfectly. Imagine, some studio makes this crazy gory anime, and it has terrible writing. Like, I've never seen anyone talk about this show unless they were trashing it. Everybody hates this shit, but everyone is watching it. And just a year later, you hear the same studio, not the same staff, just different people at the same studio, not that you care to look it up, is making an even gorier OVA, and this one is adapted from a video game that apparently has good writing. It's obviously going to benefit from attachments and similarities that just didn't exist when it was only a video game series. Now, I I actually think this is the third reason the anime remains so popular, particularly in comparison to the video game series. There was a point I tried to get at in and through my video on Quartz Party Blood Drive. There's something in human psychology that draws us to shared or vicarious experiences, even or maybe especially if it's something unpleasant. It's why I like Quartz Party and horror games in general, and I thought it would be true of those who watched the video. I figured plenty of people would want to experience or re-experience the game without suffering through it themselves, using me as a proxy. Which is a bit demeaning to me, but my video is the most watched, so I'm gratified by being correct about everything all the time. I kind of think the concept of adapting things into another medium is something similar. You have fans of the original material who will be excited to see the art they love in another form, but you can also get people who are reluctant to engage with the original for whatever reason. I guess in a lot of cases, watching something is easier than reading or playing it. I'm sure that sounds like an inch-tall barrier, but I don't know. Some people just need a bit more convincing before they invest their energy, and some people just prefer one medium over another. I can understand that, but also it can be a bit of a bummer. In my personal experience with a lot of stuff I like, I find it's often the case that not only does the original work stand on its own merit, but it can even often outshine its derivatives, at least in one area or another. That brings me to the real point of this video. How good is the Quartz Party anime, and how does it stack up against the quality of the game it's based on? Well, I have my own take, and where else should I start than at the beginning? Episode 1 starts with some establishing shots and Naomi, ostensibly the game's main character, already inside the haunted school, really setting the mood as quickly as possible before flashing back to the events of the game's prologue. It's kind of like how the game started with a scary story to set the mood immediately, since they knew a lot of the beginning portion was going to be establishing the not very scary normal life of the main cast. Except the anime also includes that scene, which makes that opening a little bit redundant. The events of the game's prologue pretty much all follow here. Yui scares her students, Yuka is introduced, Seiko and Naomi joke around, they explain that Mayu is moving away, Morishige foreshadows himself, and then they do the Shiawase no Sachiko ritual. Actually kinda impressive they fit all that into 10 or so minutes. The original game takes about half an hour to start, and although I never thought of it as feeling sluggish, the anime going this fast didn't feel like they were rushing through things at intense speed. I can tell the anime is based more on the PSP version of the game, as indicated by the scene where Satoshi grabs Naomi's boobs, but the way they chose to depict it makes me unable to fathom how he did this accidentally. The game made it sound like he was grabbing her arm and maybe brushing up against her too close, but here he's head down, hands up, full on grabbing. How'd he manage that? The episode as a whole contains pretty much all the big moments in Chapter 1, save for the one ghost who basically explains everything, which is probably for the best. Blood covered, and honestly all the games, rarely cuts conversations to save time, the only exceptions being later on when sets of characters recap events the player just experienced. This anime, though, will cut during a lull in the conversation and move along to the next scene. Here, it cuts from Seiko waking up to Naomi trying and failing to open the window to the two of them walking around. There's a lot of tricks that they have to pull to save time. For example, Naomi's sprained ankle is a recurring plot point, but the game has to describe it through text, and it's really easy to forget about it because that's the only way it's ever made more evident. The anime, however, can just animate Naomi limping, and they do so consistently until Naomi patches her up, at which point her design is slightly altered. The fact that they're alone is something they discover and talk about a lot while exploring in the game, but here they sort of establish it early on. That progression was sort of important to the tone of the chapter, which tried to be a bit lighter than most of the game, but it's saved by Seiko making a joke out of it, so it remains a lingering but distant worry. I think this scene also shows that the anime is good at maintaining the game's characterization. A lot of entries after Blood Covered made Seiko a bit unreasonably obnoxious, but here, although she's a bit of a troll, she remains within the bounds of reasonability. It's almost weird in contrast to missing footage, which seemed like it was continuing that trend. The progression of events from the game is also messed around a bit, I think mostly for the better. Although it feels like the butt cream joke arrived a little early, the fact that they never saw any corpses or ghosts until Naomi was attacking the infirmary sort of helps justify both how casual they were beforehand and how extremely emotional they got afterwards. Speaking of the attack, the shadow ghost thing in its whole segment was pretty decently animated. I feel like this must have been where a lot of the budget went, with this thing twisting around how it does. You know, there's this one shot in the game's opening where the evil shadow ghost is rendered in 3D, and it's really striking because it's pretty much the only CG part of the opening, and it also looks good. Considering the CG god thing from Future Diary, I might have thought pulling that off here would be an interesting choice, but it seems like the only bit of 3D animation that uses on the environments. On that note, I do appreciate how much use they get out of all the shots focusing on backgrounds. The first one I noticed was when they go down a floor and there's a short look at the stairs and the sound of footsteps. A lot of the time when they change location they do something like that, helps to move things along. But I also noticed during some of the dialogue heaviest scenes, especially early on, a lot of shots focus on objects or non-speaking characters. It's very endearing to me. But the one scene I think I love most of all is the one that closes the episode, where Naomi stumbles upon the nearly dead Seiko hanging in a bathroom stall. I think highly of the text-heavy approach Corpse Party has for its horror moments, because it really drags out the suffering. It forces you to actively participate without being able to look away, because you need to read it, and it allows your mind to fill in some of the blanks. But this scene from the anime makes me think that some of the faster-paced moments could do well to emulate something like this. It really helps sell the frantic urgency, not just with the constant cuts and steady pace, but also when it genuinely only lasts for about a minute. It makes for good contrast when a shot holds for just too long and the music keeps playing only for the moment to be broken by the sound of Naomi dropping the bucket off screen as she realizes she's just barely too late. The episode is closed out by Naomi's screaming, crying, and narration monologue. Unless I'm forgetting, all the voice actors are the same between the game and the anime, and these are all talented professionals. The voice direction in both is at the level of quality I can't really critique, and most of the lines are taken straight from the game. I think this is a really good episode. I already thought Chapter 1 was pretty good, and for the most part this either did well to capture that or even improved upon it. At the same time, it's very easy to foresee a pacing problem. You might have noticed I talked about time a bit. You see, if one chapter of the game took one episode, and there's 5 chapters, then they don't have enough episodes. However, it gets worse. Excluding wrong ends, Chapter 4 is significantly longer than Chapter 1, and Chapter 5 is almost twice as long. You could easily justify nearly doubling the episode count just to maintain the same chapter-episode conversion rate. What's even more striking is that because there was a nearly 1-to-1 chapter-episode conversion rate, that means they'll have to fit maybe 7 episodes worth of narrative into 3, more than doubling the current pace. But, well, let's see how much that matters in the following material. There's this really sudden tone shift at the beginning of episode 2, with 3 short segments set to the narration of unseen character Naho Sanuki, all in less than a minute. First, random people are murdered and mutilated by ghost children. Second, random people brutally murder each other as Naho explains that the setting drives people to violent insanity. Third, random mutilated people walk around like zombies with a dark energy surrounding them, as Naho explains the phenomenon of possession and erasure that the game calls the Darkening. Shortly after this, we follow up on the previous episode's ending with Naho showing up to basically tell Naomi this is why Seiko died, and telling her she's all alone now, alluding to the as-of-yet unexplained separation of the characters across different layouts of Tenjin. When I rewatched this for the review, I couldn't help but chuckle a bit over just how sheer an escalation this was compared to the previous episode. We just saw a story where the supernatural was mostly only used to exacerbate an emotional conflict, where the characters were ultimately more harm to themselves than anything they encountered. And now, immediately after that, and with no presence of any real character, the stakes are way higher. The paranormal stuff is becoming the main danger, way worse than anything else. Possession and corruption were concepts that chapters 2 and 3 of the original game took to slowly and naturally introducing, having them be glimpses of characters whose circumstances we would only later understand, or confusing events that happened to our protagonists. After coming off of Blood Drive, I kind of conceive of Blood Covered as being relatively grounded, but when all of its wild elements are presented quickly and matter-of-factly, it does come across as a bit extreme. I can understand the desire to succinctly explain these concepts, because, again, they don't have all the time for it to be explored through tangential outings or deep discussions between characters. But the disadvantages of such an approach feel really obvious. The ghost children are another thing. The presence and power of the ghost children was something really built up through multiple stressful encounters in Chapter 2, and they were alluded to a bit throughout Chapter 1. I think that was a better approach because their physicality and their strange appearances in both the original and this adaptation feels like a completely different dimension from Chapter 1's Dark Shadow Spirit. Episode 1 basically only featured brief glimpses of Sachiko, sort of as an adaptation of the short Sachiko scene in Chapter 1, but also as a way of constantly reminding the viewer of her presence. Not only did this not make anything clear, but I also think they went a bit overboard with how often they showed her off during random or sometimes pivotal moments. Makes it a little too obvious that Sachiko's important. Probably not helped by the fact that the opening features an extended look at a picture of her when she was alive, really driving home that we should keep an eye out for this exact character design. You know, I feel like they really should have cut the opening, not just because it gives away so much and looks a bit shit, but I think it could have given them 7% more time per episode, which more than counterbalances its quaint charm. Maybe double up and have the credits and ending theme over every final scene. Boost the time you have as much as possible. And I'm sure some will disagree, saying, well, the opening song is really good. You don't need to tell me that. I know this already. I am quite aware of the works of the ever-talented Asami Imai, but she already did a whole music video for it, which is way better than the opening anyway, so we don't need it. Speaking of, right after the opening comes another anime original original scene where Naho quickly gives Morishige a similar message she gave to Naomi. It's kind of interesting, not because this is the only scene in both the games and all other media that depicts him interacting with Naho, since they basically just talk past each other, but because this scene is the second time the audience is seeing Morishige. They've probably forgotten his name at this point, and he seems to have an almost protagonist-like nature, confronting problems with determination and immediately calling out for his close friend Maya. It's a big contrast against the games, where up until the end, almost every scene he's in characterizes him with an unsettling darkness. In the main story, he's one of the only characters you never play as, making the moments in which he finally gets to be the perspective character not only feel more unique, but also having them be payoff to the questions about his state of mind. I can sort of see how this impression of him as normal is going to contrast against his true self later on, but it's a very different side of him. Unfortunately, I think the effectiveness of this is really hampered by the fact that 2 minutes later Morishige is seen again, and it's so quickly turned into his game-accurate depiction where he's taking corpse pictures. And the framing of the scene is way worse than in the games. It feels like they can tell without a doubt that he's taking a picture of a corpse, as opposed to the game where it's not immediately obvious, so Satoshi at first denies the possibility. Also, in the game, Morishige insists he go off alone, whereas here, Satoshi says they should split up. For literally no reason at all. I guess an argument would have wasted a bit too much time. This episode actually has sort of an interesting format where it takes bits of chapters 2 and 3 together and mashes them around, starting with the first half of chapter 3. This works pacing-wise because chapter 3 is actually really boring, moving the plot along much less than chapter 1 or 2 did. I also don't like it because the main duo here is Satoshi and Yuka, a fairly plain character and the worst girl in the franchise. Most of chapter 3 is about finding her a bathroom. But it's a bit odd because a lot of the information that Satoshi and Yuka learn about the missing children who became the ghost children and the fact that there's ghosts in this place is stuff that's much more relevant to Ayumi and Yoshiki, who actually meaningfully interact with the ghost children. Instead, the proper introduction of Ayumi and Yoshiki sort of combines 3 different scenes. Ayumi being possessed, the ghost child attacking them, and the introduction of Naho. Now, if you've only watched the anime, the sheer amount of names I'm throwing out might confuse you, because none of the 6 or so characters central to this episode have really gotten time to introduce themselves and have their names stick in your head. I think the script finally realizes this, because it gets Ayumi to narrate an explanation of Naho's character. It's really charming to me that Corpse Party is so old that its conception of someone popular on the internet is just a blogger. The web is only relevant to the story in that Ayumi needs to have gotten information from a contemporary person she isn't really familiar with, so I think it's ultimately pretty clever. Just like in the game, Naho is a very important character because she knows enough to give the characters a solid goal, appease the spirits of the ghost children. This sort of makes sense of the fact that the previous scene had a sudden ghost child attack. They had to establish that quickly. Here, you can already see the pacing problems starting to rear their head, with setups and payoffs encountered within the span of 1 or 2 scenes from each other. The game had way longer to deal with these ideas, so it didn't come across like it was introducing concepts right before a scene where it was necessary to understand. And right after this, Naho delivers the first explanation of the fact that Tenjin comprises multiple dimensions. This is explained numerous times in the game because it's a bit of a high-concept way to justify both splitting up the characters and reusing different areas of the school. One thing that helps is the fact that the color of the floor tiles changes based upon which version of the school the characters are in, and the fact that the first 3 chapters are primarily unbroken chunks of time spent with each group, allowing you to form a solid idea of what's going on where. I think it sort of falls apart here because aside from Nami's isolation, there's not a lot put into making it feel like the characters are separated. We don't even know how big the school is. If this wasn't explained to us, we might have imagined they were just missing each other while wandering around the place. They attempted to illustrate this concept by cutting between 2 characters entering and exiting the same room, but if this wasn't paired with explicit explanation, it would just seem like they were in 2 different rooms, or perhaps in 2 different points of time. We also don't know how many different versions of the school there are and who is paired with what. It's just not very well communicated in the anime. The fact that we're only now hearing about it is also a problem because it really would have helped earlier when Satoshi stood in front of the very bathroom stall where Seiko died. In the game, you know that this is freaky because you know this is the same bathroom stall, and you can see based on the layout and the fact that you walked there the same way with both groups. In the anime, you can only guess that this must be the same one by implication, and only if you think back to it or rewatch the show. Smack dab in the middle of the episode is a very weird adaptation of the end of chapter 2. I feel like I have to play spot the differences here. In the game, Yoshiki and Ayumi, after being chased around by the ghost boy for a long time, find Mayu hang out with the 2 new ghost children in the infirmary. Quickly they piss off the ghost kids and then they encounter Naho, who sets them off to try and appease them. They think it's working until suddenly they go and splatter Mayu against the wall. The anime has a lot less build-up for the ghost kids, yeah, but they also have the teacher Miss Yui show up instead. In the game, she's barely there, and it's kind of poorly written, but I think she would have been better as a part of Ayumi and Yoshiki's group rather than stumbling around aimlessly with no knowledge of anything going on. Instead of Mayu's capture and her death being split up, up, it's instead crammed into this one scene, which sort of takes away from the alternating peril and relief the game intended to capture. You also see her panties the whole time, and while one of the game stages also does this, to be fair, it's during the initial scene, far away from her brutal death, long enough that you might forget how dumb it looked for them to do something like that. I think the idea of Yui being here and getting smacked on the head at the end of it is that it frees up Yoshiki and Ayami to only go around trying to appease spirits, rather than failing and getting split up at first. That's probably the only change here that I can appreciate compared to the original. Being as fair as I can, it would be difficult for an adaptation of Corpse Party to do Mayu's death right, even if they did have all the time and money they could ever want. A huge part of it is the matter of the difference in medium. You spend a lot of time in the game just exploring. That's not, painfully boring, because you have to interact with the game. You're putting in some amount of effort and brain power to achieve a goal. But if you were just watching the characters explore as much as they would in a video game, then it can not only easily become boring, requiring less engagement from you, but it can easily eat up way too much time. But that time is still valuable. You're getting a fuller picture of the environment. You're considering the characters and events because the game is right in front of you. Even if the last plot twist or a cute character moment wasn't super impactful in a vacuum, it can be enhanced by the echo bouncing around in your head. More than just having free time, though, Blood Covered shows how much it helps to understand the physical space of the location through interaction with the aforementioned wall corpse bit. I already talked about it before, but I feel like it's important because unless you as a player have walked down this hall to the infirmary in a real space, it can be difficult to convey how much this layout will burn itself into your brain. I can never forget this weird bend in the hallway and where it is in relation to everything else, and I must commend the subtlety with which the game draws your attention to it in Chapter 1 while making it seem inconsequential throughout Chapter 2. The shifting layouts, the different corpses, the non-linear progression of time, it all comes together to deliver a gut-punch moment of realization. I can complain about how it never came up in Episode 1, or how it was way too soon in Episode 2 to feel the same, but I really think it's hard to translate that into another medium. If you held on a shot of the hallway for long enough that I'd understand exactly how close the wall corpse is to the infirmary, it would be such a unique shot that I couldn't help but think about it. If you conveyed a similar shot later without the wall corpse, anyone with half a brain would understand the setup. It's only with the camera of a video game, objective yet incidental, that they can make this work, or at least make it work as smoothly as it does. And that's another thing. As easy as it is to establish too little, there's such a thing as establishing too much as well. The Corpse Party anime easily could have gone in a different direction, having short but dense sections which effectively communicated the layout of the school and maybe some smaller character moments during, as simulations of what the player would get through gameplay. That probably would have been preferable, but it also might go against the sort of inherent idea of ambiguity as horror. At least in Blood Covered, you need to spend minutes walking around in potentially dangerous rooms to map out the whole area, so condensing that suspense into mere seconds would, again, detract from it. Also, it would be very hard. The nature of the setting is so opposed to being understood. It's really dark, there's multiple layouts that shift around as the game goes on. It's a really thin line you have to walk to have the solidness and clarity without being too obvious. The mental map the player creates while engaging with the space can accomplish this, but a real map would go too far. I almost can't blame them for setting up and resolving the wall corpse bit in the span of one episode. If any amount of effort wouldn't match up to the original, you might as well just get it over with. But I can blame them for the fact that the immediate next scene is Morishige finding out that Mayu died. Mayu's death wasn't just a single setup and payoff. The game was able to make more horrifying moments out of it by bringing it back up with some new twist. Morishige was a part of that, the steady escalation of his questionable actions spanning a solid third of the whole game. Every time you encountered him, you knew the cruel irony awaiting him, and there was a suspense in waiting for the other shoe to drop. But here, there's not even enough breathing room to speculate on how he'd react before you get that reaction. His final scene in the game is supposed to be the answer to a mystery, an explanation for why Morishige acted the strange way he did, but in the anime, it's rarely 10 minutes after seeing him in the school at the end of his arc arrives. I love the scene in the game, but in the anime, it just has no precedent to justify it, and it goes by so fast I feel absolutely nothing. The anime sort of gets to a weird point now where it's difficult to cut between fairly simple adaptations of the game's material, so there's a few scenes that meld together different parts of the game. There's an anime original scene of Sachiko leading Sachi and Nuka around that transitions into the middle of Chapter 3 where they get separated. Sachi conveniently picks up something that won't be relevant until the final episode, but also foreshadows an important character who will show up in a few minutes. Then it cuts back to Yoshiki and Ayami placing a candle. In the game, these were save points, but also a cute bit of characterization for Ayami. They're a little less useful here, and I don't think they come back up again, but it's cute they referenced it at least. Then Yoshiki literally stumbles into the buried severed corpse of one of the ghost children, something they had to find by listening to the cursed doll in Chapter 4. Since they skip past failing to appease the ghost children, it makes sense they're immediately diving into the correct method they discovered much later. Then the ghost boy immediately shows up. This is yet another moment with this exact character, even where an element of the story is introduced and then immediately used. If you thought the pacing wasn't bad enough before, then it immediately cuts to them having a conversation where they mention that there's only one spirit they have left to appease. Yeah, that scene that just happened, they did that 2 more times off screen. They instead used this precious time to say that Satsuko is special, something you could have figured out from literally all the presentation of her character up to this point. In another scene ripped out of the middle of chapter 3, Yuka encounters Morishige and runs from him, but this time, rather than it being just that he's vaguely creepy, it's because he turned into a psycho killer. In the game, after finding out that Mayu was dead, he just jumped out a window. So it's safe to say that this is wildly out of character, in a way I don't really like. There's already a bunch of crazy killers going around, and Morishige dies in a few minutes anyway, so there was no reason to do this. The initial impression the anime gave of him feels more and more like a mistake as this episode goes along. As Morishige is chasing her down, she encounters Yuya Kizumi. Now, in the game, Kizumi spent almost half of chapter 3 tagging along with Yuka, proving himself as a strong older brother figure, before the ending had him kill one of his friends to show that Yuka was actually in danger. I think they didn't want to waste time introducing Kizumi's friends just to kill them off, so they made Morishige's target. Kizumi stabs him in front of Yuka, and then reveals he's a crazy guy with a sibling complex. This wouldn't be the last time they ruined Morishige just to bolster Kizumi. It's kind of hilarious how after speedrunning Morishige's character over half the episode, they blast through Kizaami's entire character arc in 1 single minute. They call them the barely developed duo. It bothers me even more they went down this road because, and I think I said this in another video, Yui is basically useless, and Kizumi never kills anyone important, so Kizumi should have killed Yui. In the final episode, Yui is going to die because a pillar just falls on her, so it's not like they had anything better to do with her, and they had no reason to drag Morishige out for this. And that's the end of episode 2. I really want to do a bit more broad analysis, but episode 2 was just a constant explosion of bullshit, filled to the brim with very particular examples of why the anime is not so good. In just this episode, they rushed through the events of chapter 2, chapter 3, and half of chapter 4. I guess that means they have more room to cover the second half of the story, but this episode as a whole really suffers for it, and I think the lack of time to spend with the characters before stuff gets intense just leaves a rotten foundation for the story to rest upon. To see what I mean? Let's move on. Episode 3 starts off with a short continuation of the previous episode, then an earthquake, and then it finally returns to Naomi, sitting in the same position she's been in since the end of episode 1. This scene is a short adaptation of the chapter 3 opening, and it's actually an interesting subject. Every chapter except 5 had an aside in the opening to depict a scene revolving around motherhood, whether it's someone's actual mom or just someone acting maternal. This is pretty straightforward symbolic reinforcement, so that the final chapter revealing the nature of the conflict and resolving it through the antagonist's connection to her mother doesn't come out of nowhere. The anime has mostly skipped these scenes, presumably for time purposes, but I can also see how it would be harder to make these seem just peculiar enough that you'd think about their inclusion, since the whole previous episode was switching between perspectives all willy-nilly, as opposed to the hours of steady focus you can get from the game. It's almost weird to me that this one made it through. I suppose only because they needed to express the turmoil Naomi went through while on her own, and thought it would be best to straightforwardly adapt this mostly self-contained scene. A lot of this episode, especially in the first half, is dedicated towards conveying information. Blood Covered has a grand mystery aspect going on throughout, and that's a fun part of it. It had an admittedly slightly awkward way of going about it, where the characters would either stumble upon relevant documents to learn new information, or they'd be told information that another character had already discovered. Very little of it was on-the-ground journalism, or the characters using logic to put the pieces together in their heads. Most often, the character who did the explaining was Naho, or a friend of Naho. With her, you have the built-in explanation for why she can't really act upon what she knows. She is already dead. Even the old original game did this, with a series of notes giving the player details in the story or some puzzles. It's kinda Kedwin's style of writing. The first part we get is Satoshi reading something and then later encountering Naho. Now, in the game, this scene does a lot. It gives her more characterization, it misdirects the player, it gives a cliffhanger for the end of chapter 3, and it sends Satoshi to another dimension. I kinda think that in the context of the anime, though, it's hugely useless. Over halfway through, I don't think the story needs more misdirection. Naho's already received more characterization than some members of the main cast just by having a whole scene dedicated to her. And it's in the middle of the episode, so it's not a good cliffhanger. Also, didn't the episodes release all at once? The only utility, then, is transporting Satoshi between dimensions, which, as I've gone over before, is something that they also could have chopped, seeing as the inability to establish a sense of location as well as the game could have been used to imply the characters just didn't encounter each other in such a big and broken location. They haven't spent much time dwelling on the characters' reactions to being magically rather than physically separated, and the multiple dimensions stop existing in this episode, so it was rather inefficient of them to spend time faithfully depicting the concept. The other explanation-heavy segment we get is with Yoshiki and Ayami, who find themselves back in their school along with the ghost child Yuki. Now, in the game, this occurred after a chapter-long excursion of them giving the ghost children their tongues back, with Yuki being the last one they helped. In the anime, it feels a bit random. As a standalone segment, though, I think it's really good. The anime brings its own visual flair to stand alongside the original, and the fact that Yuki is speaking from her own experience makes it feel a bit more real than Naho's secondhand accounts. There is a lot of standing around talking, but this is where the game gets better at showing instead of telling when Ayumi receives a memory of Yuki's death. I believe some of this animation is reused from the missing footage version of the scene, and I gotta say, I didn't have a very clear memory of Tortured Souls when I was rewatching missing footage for this, so when I did, I was thinking, wow, this looks ugly. I guess the anime was ugly all along, and I never realized it. But I think that was mostly missing footage. This particular scene isn't too bad, but there's a lot of flat compositions and ugly faces. Now that's still the case sometimes in this longer OVA, but having my expectations so low allowed me to be slightly impressed that I couldn't note the flaws in every single scene, despite the fact that I've already watched this twice before. It is very noticeable that a lot of the time when something spooky happens, they tilt the camera a bit. One could say that it gets hilarious once you notice it. I rewatched it even more for the sake of this video. I think it's been like 5 times now, and that's when I did start to notice more problems. The biggest one is that they're not good at abstracting darkness. Most of the time when a shot is well lit, it's because they found a way to work in the light from outside, or from the few functional electronic light sources. Despite building up the candles, they're only seen in the beginning, which is a bit of a shame because it looks good there. When a scene doesn't have diegetic lighting, they just make it actually dark. There are very significant moments where it's difficult to make out the details on the screen. The game generally understood how to make the school look dark without actually obscuring important visual information. Sometimes they put on a vignette to make it actually dark, but even that wouldn't obscure literally everything. Oh yeah, and Sachiko's the real killer. Doesn't feel like nearly as much as a surprise in the anime because there was almost no attention given to the character of Yoshikazu. You could easily get to this point and be like, who the hell is Yoshikazu? It's a janitor, by the way. He kidnapped the ghost children. Meanwhile, an undue amount of importance was placed upon Sachiko, and with all the relevant foreshadowing about her being delivered in roughly an hour, it's really obvious. But here, the anime starts to get interesting. So, a big part of Corpse Party is all the different endings. The wrong ends are basically just extended fancy game over segments, but they greatly enhance the horror by showing the characters dying in some gruesome way. And in the original game, a lot of them had something interesting about them, whether it's the prose, the method of failure, or the way they show a different side of a character that can only come out when things are well and truly over. Unfortunately, this is another almost irreconcilable problem in adapting the game into anime. Unless you're making some weird interactive show, you're just gonna have to depict a single linear series of events. You can't really pull an Amagami when you barely have the budget for 4 whole episodes. But instead of just straightforwardly depicting the canon route and missing a lot of memorable moments locked behind alternate endings, they decided to combine a bit of the single most iconic wrong end and a bit of the infamous other end into the true end. So, first of all, Yoshiki decides to stay behind. In the game, this is the real low point for Yoshiki, whose jealousy had previously only manifested as protective behavior towards Ayumi. Here, he's turning it into accusatory vitriol, dropping all selflessness. I kinda worry that the anime doesn't sell this as well, because in a vacuum, it's understandable that he wouldn't want to go back, and Ayumi might seem a bit harsh, but considering the characterizations of both of them, it makes sense for her and is a regression for him. The anime's direction here does decide to focus mostly on Ayumi's face, even while Yoshiki is talking, and I think it's a good way to simulate that idea, focusing on her reaction to it. She seems really hurt by it, and it's probably the best they can do to say that Yoshiki is in the wrong. Second of all, Yuka is captured by Kizumi. This is a bit of a complicated aside, but in the game, the wrong end that the anime is adapting here can be triggered in 2 different ways, and since the story has to go the same way regardless, it means there's 2 different ways that Yuka can die. If you get caught by Kizumi, there's an extended scene where he tries to kill her, but then the janitor busts in and does it instead. The game then forces Yoshiki to stay behind with no room for player input. If you survive Kizumi but make the wrong choice as Yoshiki, then Yuka gets killed by Sachiko shortly after. Aside from that, somewhere along the main path, Yoshiki and Ayumi can encounter an anatomical model implied to be the undead corpse of Kizumi. It's a cute reference to the old original game. The anime's version of this sort of combines all of these into one. Yuka avoids Kizumi at first, gets scared off by Sachiko, but then encounters Kizumi again, now as the anatomical model. I understand that the anatomical model is an iconic bit, but I think that it's not really used well here. The point of it in the game is that it's supposed to look harmless for a moment before attacking you, but it basically is just a redesign for Kizumi. I understand that they wanted to reference it, but the work put in to basically just give Kizumi a new skin, or lack thereof, is another example of time being used inefficiently here. To the anime's credit though, if this more closely followed the game's main continuity, then I could have said that Kizumi's inclusion is also a pointless diversion to the fact that none of his actions resulted in anything besides Yuka pissing herself. Here, he actually just kills Yuka. Yuka's screams are set up as the reason why all the disconnected characters finally unite, but oddly the first person to show up is Yoshiki. In the game, he has a whole bit where he gets mad and calls for the ghost child to bring him in, only for him to show up later already dead. So while this is a much more interesting use for his character, again, it lacked precedent. Also, he ends up dying in the process, but not because of Kizumi, instead it's the janitor. In this section with the anatomical model in the game, the janitor was just there as an additional threat. So I guess in both cases he kinda comes out of nowhere. I think think this is a much more interesting take on it, though. Instead of him simply dying off-screen, he comes back from his low moment with a heroic sacrifice. It actually works a bit better as a character arc, even if it's built out of pieces that weren't meant to form a whole story. The episode just ends with the three survivors reconvening as two of their friends die in front of them. At this point, I'm thinking back to that ANN review I mentioned earlier. I guess I didn't say it before, but it cited weak pacing, storytelling, and characterizations as negatives. Now, if this were the game, I'd probably have a lot to say against that, but I kinda agree for the anime adaptation. I think this episode in particular is where the previous pacing really starts to hurt it, because I've kept saying that, well, in the game there was this context and this scene and stuff like that. Ryushki's character arc in the anime is missing his determination to protect Ayami, the reasons why she means so much to him, the struggles he had to endure up to that point. It has to rely entirely on performance and direction to make his refusal to return a big moment, and it doesn't have enough time to showcase his regret over that. His death has to share the spotlight with Yuka. There's none of the lingering sorrow that made the central ideas of grief hit hard in the game version. There's a bit of something in the concept here, but I'm really just repeating myself in saying that they didn't have the time to pull it off. Even if they took the measures I'm proposing, I have to give them credit and say that 2 hours was not enough. Anyway, Episode 4 has a quick intro to show off Naho's backstory before getting right into the opening theme. Now I'm just sitting here thinking about the fact that they've just dipped their toes into Chapter 5, which comprises about a third of the game's runtime, and they have a quarter of the OVA runtime to adapt it. Maybe the team that made this anime didn't think about it in such terms, but I kinda enjoy making this comparison as numerical ratios. To me, it just reinforces the sheer mathematical impossibility of the endeavor, how they were doomed from the start, and makes me think I should approach the end product with a gentler eye. On the other hand, I guess they did sort of achieve the impossible. The anime was popular. It still is relative to the series as a whole. It was popular enough that they made a live-action film adaptation and based it heavily on the anime's version of events. I mean, does something being big remove the necessity to pull punches on it? Does that outweigh the disadvantages it had from a production standpoint? Are these even comparable at all? I don't really have the answer. The opening is followed by the three main characters sitting in front of a CRT television. Now, it took me a second to realize this because I'm so familiar with the game, but this is probably confusing to the average person. Let's ignore the fact this is the first time the anime is showing the TV, something that had more precedent in the game. Let's ignore the fact that Ayami saying Kabiki's name here is the first time you've heard his name in the anime. Obviously, that has more precedent in the game. There is an attempt at the Cool Shop effect that's broken by the OP playing in between the filtered footage of Naho killing Kibiki and the television with the survivors watching. Like, I know that these three are sitting horrified watching the footage because this is an adaptation of an event from the game. But if you watch the whole opening, it would take your brain a moment to make the connection here because of that interruption. They really should have cut the opening, is basically my point here. Ayami delivers basically all of the plot-relevant information in a few minutes, which makes for a very efficient start. There's one line that's very funny to me, which is that they don't know about Mayu or Yui. It reminded me that the currently incapacitated Yui and the currently dead Morishige are the only ones who know what happened to Mayu, and that Yui's only plot relevance will be delivering the information Mayu is dead to Ayami before unceremoniously getting killed off. Very funny. Not like her role in the original game was very depthful or interesting. She was the least important character by far, who basically just existed to die. But the anime doesn't really fix that. Half of the episode is just rushing through the investigations of Chapter 5 to get to the ending. Ayami confronts Naho about spreading the dangerous Sachiko ritual that got them all trapped here on the internet and lying about it, resulting in the deaths of dozens of teenagers. Once again, the anime whittles down a slowly escalating interaction to a minute of screen time. The story of the principal being the world's most evil piece of shit to Sachiko and her mother is delivered in segments in the game, and the anime makes the interesting choice to bounce between all the revealing moments quite quickly. That leads us to the basement, the game's final dungeon. I already talked about the anime's issue with environment conveyance during the episode 2 bit, but I think it's fair to once again compare the game having the bomb shelter alluded to throughout, whereas the anime basically just has to place it in without warning. I will give credit to the fact that it's extremely unclear where the principal's office is in the anime, which alleviates the problem the game has, where the only way into the basement is from the highest floor in the entire school. Also, this episode has a lot more diegetic lighting, which I guess is the only way they're willing to make anything visible. The whole show looks so much better this way. The final scene of the game is played alongside Sachiko's appeasement. The former at least has an episode's worth of character development to justify it, but, and I sound like a broken record at this point, the text message doesn't have the precedent it did in the game. The twist lands so weakly here that I feel like they could have cut it, which is probably the greatest indictment of the anime's capacity to emulate the power of the original work. However, I sort of like the appeasement scene in a this is kind of funny way. It's like an action scene where Sachi is barely holding Sachiko back while trying to reach out to her. They try and make it a lot more visually interesting than everyone just standing around, even if it's borderline unreadable. Real problem with the 180 rule in this show? I laughed out loud when Satoshi slowly lowered the scissors from Sachiko's hand. So, throughout this whole episode, they've been setting up that the only way to get out is to redo the ritual. They show Naomi reaching into her pocket, poking at some random corpse. Clearly she lost her scrap. At the very end, Satoshi says he figured out what happened, says she should use his, and that he has Yuka's. As they do the ritual, the show focuses on Kizumi's student ID, which Satoshi picked up in episode 2 with a scrap of paper inside. The implication's obvious. He worried that something bad would happen to Naomi, so he took it upon himself. This is a completely original idea the anime rolls with. There's nothing really equivalent to this in the game or any other parts of the franchise that came before it. And instead of really lingering on the question, the anime just shows the outcome. Naomi and Ayami, each holding one of Satoshi's severed arms. On one hand, pun not intended, this is so fucking funny, the abruptness with which this new problem sees its climax and aftermath, followed by the cut to black ending of the entire show. I mean, you have the post-credits scene, but that's just the opening of Book of Shadows. But forget that for a minute. This is just how it ends. A dude lost his arms. I don't know if it's just because back in the day all my friends made fun of this, saying shit like, looks like he needs a hand, but I just can't see this anymore without cracking up a bit. On the other hand, pun still not intended, I actually think this kind of is a cool ending from a certain perspective. I've complained before about Yuka being basically useless in the true end, how the only way in which she contributes to the themes of loss is in the other end, where she dies and facilitates the suffering of Satoshi, and just how pathetic it is that they put her in every sequel and continue to do nothing with her. I'm definitely not just saying this because I hate her as a character and think she should die, but that's also true. So, I can really respect the decision for the anime to decide to make this the canon end. Yuka dies, Yoshiki dies, even Satoshi dies. Satoshi never dies. In the old original game, he's the only one who can't be killed no matter what ending. But here, all these characters have a role with a definitive ending. You could even read into it and say that Satoshi was only willing to sacrifice himself so readily because he lost Yuka, which adds another layer to his somewhat shallow character. I can admit it, every Quartz Party game is a little bit too concerned about having a sequel. After Blood Cover, they didn't really kill off any of the main cast, just so that they have options of who to bring back in later entries. And I wasn't a huge fan of that because, being as generous as I can, it felt like they could have at least laid some to rest in Blood Drive. Even Blood Covered was guilty of this by having two main endings, one where 5 survive and one where 3 survive, and of course only the former is canon. With the ending of the anime, they've basically blocked themselves off from making a straightforward sequel adaptation. They could still do the side stories from Book of Shadows, and it's not like the Machida siblings were important to Blood Drive at all, but they'd have to put quite a bit of thought into an adaptation of that story where Yoshiki's dead. They're basically just letting this anime be the end of it all. And, to me, that gives it at least a single point of credit above the source material. Alright, now that we've reached the end, I can finally give a score to Quartz Party Tortured Souls, Bogyaku Sareta Tamashi no Jukyo. Judged based on its direction, pacing, writing, faithfulness, and sound design, my final score out of 100 is, play the video game. But no, for real, I think the anime is cute and fun if you're a fan of the game, but if you're looking to get someone into the series, this might not be the best impression of the strongest points of Quartz Party. It's just kinda missing a lot of them. Almost by its nature, it cannot capture what Blood Covered has going for it. Perhaps if someone is a much bigger fan of animation than computer games, they'll have a preference for this, but even ignoring faithfulness and comparing them as standalone products, the anime isn't very good. Maybe some people will be convinced by hearing the game is much better than the anime, but if the anime leaves too poor an impression, the jump in quality might still not seem worth the trouble. I would even say it's sort of difficult to fully understand what happens in the story from watching the anime, as instead of effectively abridging it, it just omits key moments. You're probably gonna have to check out the game anyway. If you're looking for a decent, low-investment introduction, missing footage on its own is probably fine enough for that. Or you can just play the game cold turkey, it's a good game. They keep releasing it on modern platforms and all. And, well, not to date this video, but soon, we'll live in a world where a second standalone Quartz Party game will exist. If that serves as a viable entry point for newcomers and is preferable to the anime, then I wonder if, in the future, this won't even warrant being a point of discussion. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, I should stay in my lane.